So I could actually use all my minutes. Leo, can I actually try and
Yes.
put this down? Thanks. Just looking around the audience in terms of who is here, from Dissent and American Prospect to Debbie Meyer and Liz Schuler and Mary Kay Henry, and Jerry Hudson. You start seeing here, and Joe Carton, thank you, Joe, is the intellectual brain of our movements. And I just am really honored that everyone is here, and I want to thank Leo for the work and the visionary work that you did for saying this is really important to have this discussion at this moment in time. And in some ways, what just happened in Baltimore makes it even more important, and I am on my way there right after this. So let me just talk a little bit about what we wanted to say, or I wanted to say as part of a keynote. Leo talked about the public square as a metaphor for political voice, for robust civil and political life, and for public institutions that create the infrastructure to ultimately grow a shared economy, an economy that is a fair economy. All are critical to democracy, and all are under assault. And you start seeing how all of this gets connected in a very, very perilous way. Leo talked a bit about the idea of a public square. It's like, in an ideal world, it's the Norman Rockwell painting. It's the speaker's box in a public courtyard where anyone, whether you're in a city or in McDowell County, West Virginia, where anyone, black, white, rich, poor, can speak about anything. That does not exist anymore in a real way. There is a growing and harmful effort across America to make the public square smaller and smaller, and to silence working people and to stifle their economic aspirations. And even when it does exist, think about the marginalization and demonization that ends up happening when we end up doing peaceful protest. Just turn on Fox TV. Even the term public, once celebrated as part of our national identity, is under relentless attack from governors like Scott Walker, Bobby Jindal, and even Andrew Cuomo. Public services are being privatized, and public employees are demonized, laid off, or muted. Who would have thought a Democratic governor with the last name Cuomo would say that the public education system is a monopoly that must be broken up? We're dealing with the equivalent of tectonic plates across America. On the one side, we have the deck stacked against working families, attacks on the rights of workers, tax breaks for corporations, and the elevation of the wealthy few. On the other side, we have working families whose wages have been stagnant for decades, who don't just want to get by, they want to get ahead, and they are clamoring for change, sometimes in all the wrong places, but clamoring for change. The gap between rich and poor is growing. The American dream has been eroded and out of reach for too many Americans who play by the rules and aspire for a better life. The middle class has been squeezed. People's lives have been upended by stagnant wages, lingering effects, I should say, of the greatest recession since the Great Depression, rising household and college costs. Everyone in this room could have made the same speech I just did. Today, inequality in America has reached historic heights, and economic polarization is more extreme than it was during the Gilded Age that Leo and I often taught about, the Gilded Age of robber barons. Today, the wealthiest 10% have reaped benefits of income gains, while the rest are dealing with stagnant wages. From the mid-90s to today, income grew by 62% for the top 1%, but just 7% for the bottom 99%. Let me try to make this a little clearer. American CEOs in 2013 earned an average of $11.7 million, 333 times the average worker's salary of $35,293. In 2012, 3.6 million workers earned salaries at or below the federal minimum wage. Corporate executives can legally pay a lower tax rate than their secretaries, and workers across the country have to fight for something very humane, paid sick leave. What does this tell us? The public square is not working for the average person. It's dominated by unaccountable private money, which has increased income inequality and slowed down social mobility. The concentration of economic wealth in the hands of a very few has facilitated the growth of political power in those very same hands. 3 pivotal Supreme Court decisions have helped make this happen: Buckley v. Vallejo, McCutcheon v. FEC, and Citizens United. By declaring that corporate campaign expenditures are constitutionally protected free speech, and by overturning long-established limits on independent campaign expenditures, these decisions have unleashed an avalanche of money into the public square. Let me talk about economy and inequality and education as 2 examples that show how this money has undermined the ethos of the public square: democracy, economy, education. Since the Citizens United's decision, funding through super PACs, organizations whose contribution limits were eviscerated by the Supreme Court, reached $1 billion. And more than $600 million of that total has come from just 195 donors and their spouses. Needless to say, this has distorted the notion that the public square is open to all viewpoints. The biggest megaphone now belongs to those with millions or billions to spend, like the Koch brothers or Sheldon Adelstein, not the 3rd-grade teacher, not the underpaid, overworked custodian, not the nurse with unsafe patient load, or the firefighter who saves lives. The nation's greatest representative democracy should be influenced by all people, not just those 195 donors I just spoke about. Consider what's happening in Baltimore. Income inequality and neglect of our urban communities has a lot to do with what we've been witnessing there. The trigger event was the horrendous, now more explained death of an unarmed black man as the indictments came today. But it unleashed a groundswell of anger that's been pent up for years in that city, and not dissimilar to urban areas across the country, whether they've been on the news lately or not. I, like so many others, obviously condemn the violence we saw in Baltimore Monday night, but we must equally condemn the inequality, the bias, and the racism that spawned those riots. Martin Luther King was exactly right when he said that we cannot deplore the street violence of riots without also condemning the pervasive social and economic violence that gives rise to them. Again, how many people in this room could say that over and over and have said that over and over and over again? There is a pervasive feeling of hopelessness that stems from poverty and joblessness. It is this crisis that we must deal with on so many levels, with the institutions of the public square, the public good. People are searching for ways to transform the economic system that has benefited the lucky few from the many. Many of us in this room spend hours of time trying to figure that out. We're looking for fairness, for opportunity, for justice, for real change. And frankly, I believe that that search does lead to the labor movement. A strong labor movement helps create the advocacy, the power, and the much-needed checks and balances so that workers and the people they represent get a fair shot. But the ideological right is intent on eviscerating unions and worker voice. Let me say quickly, I'm not talking about just as we have in different forums, just, the labor movement of old or the industrial labor movement. I'm talking about new forms and thinking about how we do this in new forms, not just in old forms. Unions and public sector employment has been central to the growth of the middle class. Strong public unions in auto, steel, mining, and textile industries produced that great leveling of the American economy that we saw from the New Deal to the Great Society. But as we also all know in this room, that over the past decades, union density has declined, and so too has the middle class, and as a result, so too has income equality. Today, just 11% of American workers belong to a union, and a study in the American Sociological Review estimates that the decline in unions may account for 1/3 of the rise in income inequality. And my understanding is there's a report soon to be released that will say and show that the single most important reason or way to actually crack social immobility is belonging to a union. As Hillary Clinton put it, and I quote, "The American middle class was built in part by the right for people to organize and bargain." And I would add my own appendage, which is that the American middle class can be rebuilt by the right for people to organize and bargain. Again, not simply in the structures we know. We need to do and deal with many different structures, and I just really want to lift up what Mary Kay Henry and SEIU have been doing in terms of trying to do many of those things, as well as other unions, but what they've been doing for the Fight for 15 has been really awesome. Thank you very, very much. Yet, even though we know this, there's an all-out war on the public sector and on their unions, our unions. There's a massive vilification campaign that's underway. Just go to my Google alert and you'll see it every other minute, attempting to silence workers or curb or eliminate collective bargaining. I love this example of the difference between Wisconsin and Minnesota. Because think about it, just look at the evidence, and you see that the strategy of vilification, the strategy of a race to the bottom, the strategy of trickle down, the strategy of evisceration doesn't work if what we're trying to do is improve the economy and improve lives. Just before Wisconsin's Governor Scott Walker's reelection bid, he promised Wisconsin families that he wouldn't attack their unions anymore. He was over it. But then 48 hours after a Wall Street donor gathering, he changed his mind. His relentless attacks on workers are hurting that state's economy. And he proudly uses his anti-union attacks in Wisconsin to set up his potential presidential campaign, even having the audacity to say that his dismantling of public sector unions in Wisconsin proves that he could take on Al-Qaeda and ISIS. But next door, in Minnesota, there's quite a different story. While Walker cut taxes for the wealthy and attacked workers, Minnesota's Governor Mark Dayton raised taxes on the wealthy in a progressive way and has supported workers. Did so during the height of the economic recession in terms of raising taxes, but has consistently supported workers. The public square, the public good, I would argue is much better represented by Governor Dayton than Governor Walker, and just look at the results. Forbes ranks Minnesota, not Dissent, not American Prospect, but Forbes ranks Minnesota as the 9th best state in the country for business. Wisconsin is ranked 32nd. As for economic climate, Minnesota is ranked 7th, Wisconsin is ranked 27th. And while Scott Walker's policies have resulted in a $2 billion deficit, Mark Dayton in Minnesota this year had a $1.2 billion surplus. Governors and policymakers have a clear choice. They can push ideological policies to break the backs of unions and workers, and as we've seen, not just in Wisconsin, they see their deficits grow, workers' wages sink, and their states ranked lower for business and economic climate. Or they can do what Minnesota has done. It's a pretty clear choice. It shouldn't be a hard one, and yet it is one that is litigated in the absence of evidence every single day. So the war on the public sector continues. From Wisconsin and Ohio to Michigan and Indiana, legislation directed against the rights of public sector workers to organize, to bargain collectively, to exercise political voice, have all been adopted into law, everything aimed at economic and democratic voice. California and New York, court cases have been launched against teachers' rights to due process in their workplace. And in California, a case that's going straight to the Supreme Court, trying to break the back of union infrastructure. Take public education. It's a particularly powerful example of the problems I've just been talking about. How do we create the conditions to help all children, not just some, succeed? If this is not a critical issue to the public square, I don't know what is. Public education has the potential to be the great equalizer and is one of the few public goods left in the United States. It can help stabilize and bring together communities, and it is one of the best opportunities to promote pluralism and diversity and limit divisiveness and polarization. But here's the reality. Across the country, half of all public school students are poor. Half. And in urban areas, that number spikes to an average of 64%. 64%. Every public square has a school on the corner. But public education must get the attention of the institutions of the public square to deal with poverty and its consequences. Poverty is a key driver in student achievement. Without a vibrant and engaged public square, then teachers become the scapegoats when schools and student performance struggles. It can't all be on a teacher's back. We know what the economists tell us. Yes, of course, teachers play an important role. Yet the economists are telling us they only account for about 10% of the variance in student achievement. It takes the rest of the public square to focus on the other 90%. Certainly, it hasn't been focused on in federal education policy. We need to use the public square to focus on that. And there are two different philosophies around this. One says, lift all boats, provide the supports, the resources, the programs to help mitigate the effects of poverty in schools with high concentrations of poor children. Form the collaborative partnerships with teachers, parents, policymakers, community that Debbie Meyer is so famous for. The other says, this is a little bit like trickle down, adopted to education, test kids, sanction teachers, and tell families to pull themselves up by the bootstraps. Test prep and high-stakes testing have robbed kids of robust education that they need for democratic citizenship, including non-tested subjects like civics, music, and art. And yet the test and sanction strategy hasn't worked. To the believers, it's somebody else's fault. It hasn't worked because the teachers didn't focus enough. The unions didn't help enough. Parents didn't try enough. Really? How do you blame the first responders for our kids? How do you blame teachers when we know that student achievement has been flat over this decade? Why don't we look at a different strategy? But instead, the same people who have done the same work in terms of the democracy have been pushing vouchers and charters and other types of privatization that have no track record. And as I said, among those pushing this agenda, when you pull the curtain away, are the billionaire hedge fund managers who give massive political contributions, receive tax advantages that exacerbate income inequality, and dictate public education policy that focuses on charters and vouchers. What we need to do is invest to give kids with the most needs, the most resources. Not a blank check. And I'm not saying that our union has been perfect in every way. It hasn't been. And we need to learn from evidence, and we need to correct excesses when we see them. But one solution is community schools. These are public schools that become the center of community. They become the public square, that bricks and mortar. They give poor children and their families what they need to climb up the ladder of opportunity. They provide a strong curriculum, but also become a safe harbor and a safety net for families with interventions like healthcare and social services and counseling, tutoring, mentoring, after-school services, and other wraparound services that kids need and their families need to level the playing field. They are, in some ways, the bricks and mortar of the public square. A place that's open at night and weekends, a place that brings parents into schools, a place where parents want to send their kids, educators want to work, and kids are engaged. Across the country, we've seen the hits and misses of education policy, and I might add that these hits and misses aren't insignificant. They affect the very lives of and futures of our kids. Since the 2007 recession, austerity measures have resulted in massive disinvestment in our schools. 30 states still fund education at pre-recession levels. Even Federal Reserve Chair Janet Yellen recently remarked, and I quote, "The United States is one of the few advanced economies in which public education spending is often lower for students in lower income households than students in higher income households." Underfunded public education has resulted in teacher layoffs, larger class sizes, and narrowed curriculum with a fixation on what's being tested instead of what's good for kids. What's being tested has become the only thing that counts, and counting in a punitive way for teachers and schools. Music, art, foreign languages have lost out to math and English. Don't get me wrong, math and English are very important, but there's no balance yet left. Music, art, foreign languages, physical education, they open children's minds, they open children's souls, they open children's physicality. It is what gets kids excited about coming to school. As a teacher in Liverpool, New York, or from Liverpool, New York, told me last night, music is so important. A concert fills an auditorium, allows people to experience it together. That's what music does. And frankly, the top performing countries in the world didn't let the recession stop their investment in education, and student performance rankings bear out that decision. Vulnerable communities and their schools have been a target by corporate interests and anti-public school ideologues. We've seen forces intent on closing public schools and turning to charters and private school vouchers. Their objective, in my judgment, is much more to dismantle public education as it is to help the few kids that they may serve. Left by the side of the road is the ideal of public schools as anchors of communities and neighborhoods. We see this in Newark, New Jersey, Chicago, Philadelphia, New Orleans, yet no one can honestly hold them up as models of positive change. Detroit tried the close, don't fix privatization strategy, and a recently released report by the Coalition of the Future of Detroit School Children, a coalition of civic leaders throughout that city, including that mayor, acknowledged the failed strategies of the past and recommended, amongst other things, the creation of strong neighborhood community schools and the state-of-the-art career and tech center. In closing, let me just say this. As a nation, we must champion fairness, democracy, and economic opportunity. All of us, those of us who fight for democracy, we must fight as much for fairness and education and economic opportunity, and the same for those of us who fight for educational opportunity. We have to chart a course for the future that realizes the American dream is a dream of equal opportunity, of liberty, of justice, not just for the privileged few, but for all. And that high-quality public education is the road that helps all students, not just some, dream their dreams and achieve them. Those are words that we need to say in the public square, not just words that Leo and I taught our kids at Clara Barton High School. So what can we do to put the balance back in the public square? Obviously, elections matter. We need to work as hard as possible to elect state and city and district and county lawmakers, governors, members of Congress, and a president who understands the needs of the many, the 99%, as opposed to obeying the requests of the wealthy. We could also call for a constitutional amendment for public financing of campaigns to overcome the undue influence of money. But in that call, we must also actually register a real campaign. Obviously, the obstacles are high. We couldn't even get an equal rights amendment passed. And we clearly need to rebuild the labor movement to make sure workers and the people that we serve get a fair shot. But I would say this, it's not enough just to focus on democracy issues and to focus on growing the labor movement. Our nation needs comprehensive education and industrial policies that are also aligned with what families and communities need to thrive. Preparing today's students with a high-quality, robust K-12 education and a higher education with good jobs waiting for them is what we need to move forward. But none of this will happen if we don't recreate the public square. Because if we don't recreate the public square, we're not going to be able to reclaim the promise of America, where a public square is restored and where the issues of economic and education opportunity are justly and robustly debated, and where everyone, not just those 194 donors, where everyone has a shot at the democracy that we so love. Thank you.